Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on Facebook this evening. My name is Jeff Fowler. I'm SLU's Vice President for Marketing and Communication, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's Facebook Live event, where we'll be hosting two of our own nationally recognized infectious disease experts for a discussion about the search for a vaccine and a treatment for COVID-19. With us tonight, Dr. Daniel Hoft is the principal investigator of SLU's Vaccine Treatment Evaluation Unit, also known as the VTEU, and he's director of the Division of Infectious Diseases, Allergy, and Immunology at SLU. He is also director of the Center for Vaccine Development. And Dr. Sarah George is an associate professor of infectious diseases, allergy, and immunology at SLU, and is the principal investigator of a COVID-19 treatment being conducted right now at St. Louis University. Before we begin with questions for Dr. Hoft and Dr. George, I want to acknowledge two major contributions this week to the Center for Vaccine Development. SLU Medical School alumnus Dr. Stephen Piper and his wife Dr. Zhen Wang donated $750,000 to the center to support research aimed at new vaccines for COVID-19 and other illnesses. This gift will establish a center of excellence in vaccine research and will be called the Stephen C. Piper and Zhen Wang Institute for Vaccine Science and Policy. Also this week, Dr. Jeannie Sinkfield and Rex Sinkfield announced the latest round of funding totaling $765,000 from their 2018 $50 million gift to the university that will support several innovations in COVID-19 related research, along with critical specialized equipment. The funds will be shared across multiple departments, disciplines, investigators, and faculty. And we thank them all very much for their contributions to the research that we'll be talking about here tonight. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. You'll be able to submit questions on the chat function of Facebook Live. So let's begin right away. First, let me start with you, Dr. Hoft. You're the head of SLU Center for Vaccine Development, which houses one of the country's only 9 elite VTEUs around the country. That means SLU is on the front lines in developing new vaccines and treatments for infectious diseases. What is a VTEU and what role does SLU play in helping develop a vaccine for COVID-19 and other diseases?
Well, before I answer that, let me just add my thanks to the generous donors that have provided us with very generous funding to conduct more of the work that we're doing. What a VTEU is, VTEU stands for Vaccine and Treatment Evaluation Unit. This is a designation that is given to sites that are awarded NIH initially contracts, now in the new cycle of grant, which fund work to develop vaccines for pretty much everything except for HIV in human clinical trials, phase 1 through phase 4. So the 9 units that are currently funded work together to try to develop new vaccines to protect the US public and also the world. The other major function that we serve is in national preparedness, which is very relevant right now. We have been involved in multiple efforts to try to protect the US public against imminent threats or ongoing threats from the time of after 9/11 and concerns about bioweapons to the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, to avian flu scares, Zika, and now COVID-19. So that is really what the VTEU network does and what we provide in value to the US public.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hoft. Dr. George, you're leading the study of an investigational treatment for COVID-19. Can you tell us about the study and where it stands at this point?
Well, thank you. This is an extremely important study. This is sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, and we are running it here at St. Louis University Hospital This is a study of a promising antiviral drug called remdesivir made by Gilead, which is being studied in people hospitalized at St. Louis University Hospital with COVID-19 disease. This drug looks very promising in animal models of viruses closely related to COVID, the coronavirus causing the current outbreak. And there has been recently published, including just today, some very promising, though not definitive data, looking like this drug may be very promising. So we're very glad to have this trial, and we're going on with it, and it will continue for weeks to come. Thank you.
Dr. George, if I could follow up, is this the drug that people may have heard about that was used to help treat Ebola?
Yes, this was used in some Ebola treatment trials in the outbreaks in Africa.
Great, thank you both very much. A number of you submitted questions ahead of time, and we appreciate that. And we're going to start with some of those that we received. Dr. Hoff, let's start with you. There has been a lot written and said that it takes a minimum of 18 months, perhaps longer, to develop and make ready a vaccine for a virus like COVID-19 or other viruses. Can you talk about why it takes that long? I think people wonder why it can't be done quicker than that.
Sure, Jeff. The two main things that you have to do when you're developing a vaccine for use in humans is very carefully study the safety of the vaccine and very carefully study the effects of that vaccine in terms of being able to provide a protective immune response. To do this, you start with of course, there's a lot of work done before you ever get into humans. You have to identify what molecule from a pathogen could be used, or the whole pathogen, in what form it could be used for a vaccine. You have to do animal studies to see if it works, and then there's no major toxicity issues. And then you have to make the vaccine in a way that it can ramp up to large numbers of doses, so it would be useful for the long term once you get through the clinical trials. That's not always easy. Sometimes vaccines fail at the step of trying to scale up. After getting GMP material, good manufacturing practice material, which has been generated in a way to minimize chances to almost zero that there's any contamination that could cause any harm to anyone. This is then the time when you can start thinking about doing clinical trials in humans. You start with few. A phase 1 trial usually just has maybe a few dozen individuals or up to 40 or 50 subjects. And what you're really looking for in the first in-human trial is whether or not there's any really big safety problems. Of course, you're also looking at whether or not the vaccine induces any immune response. But you're not getting at the heart of the matter of whether or not it can actually protect the population against the disease it's intended to. So you move on to phase 2, assuming there's no big safety signals in phase 1, and you see some signal of immunogenicity or inducing an immune response. And in phase 2, you have larger numbers of people. And the same thing happens going into phase 3. So you progressively go from small numbers of subjects to larger numbers, and then large enough numbers to where you can have the statistical power to look at whether or not this vaccine really does protect people significantly. So all that takes a lot of time to do it right, to do it safe, and to make sure that we know whether or not the vaccine can work.
Great, thank you. Dr. George, a number of people submitted questions around this question about whether a person's blood type has any impact on whether they are more or less likely to get COVID-19 or provide any protection.
Well, thank you. So I think that comes out of some data from China, where they looked at blood types of people hospitalized with COVID-19, and then also blood types in the surrounding region. And they showed that people with blood type O were underrepresented in the hospitalized population relative to the surrounding population. However, there certainly were people with blood type O who were hospitalized with COVID disease. And also, they only looked at people who were sick enough to be hospitalized, not those who were well enough to stay home. So the data is intriguing, but it's not definitive. And please do not think that if you have blood type O, you're protected. You're not.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up, Dr. George, with you again. There has been a lot of discussion in the media and in other places about the drug hydroxychloroquine as a possible treatment. Can you give us your perspective on whether there are trials taking place of that drug and where they stand at this point?
Well, the good news is that there are trials taking place of hydroxychloroquine, which has been much hyped and I would say overhyped in the media. And we need to do those trials, just like the study we're doing now at St. Louis University with remdesivir, where we really need to get accurate data to see if something actually works. And that means we have to compare it with just supportive care only. I shouldn't say just supportive care, because supportive care is actually the only thing that's really approved for COVID disease at this time. To date, the studies published on hydroxychloroquine really don't look very promising, including some very recent data that's just come out where it just doesn't look like it's having much, if any, effect at all. So again, right now, there's no real data to show that it's a beneficial drug, and we just really need to do the studies and understand it one way or the other.
Great. Hey, Dan?
Yeah, just if I could add, the other issue that has come up is that there are a lot of patients that use hydroxychloroquine, and we need chloroquine for malaria treatment. And patients with autoimmune diseases tend to take hydroxychloroquine, and chloroquine is good for the malaria infection. So those indications are very important, and there's limited amounts of these drugs. So it is an issue if people start using a lot of a drug, particularly if it's not shown to work. It takes away from the ability to treat other people with other significant diseases, because there are limited amounts of these drugs.
And again, because it's been so talked about, I've also read and heard stories about some side effects from the use of hydroxychloroquine, including possible heart issues. Dr. George?
Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you for making that point. Hydroxychloroquine does have some very real effects on the heart, particularly people with heart disease. And as has been discussed, people with heart disease are among the groups most vulnerable to COVID-19 disease. So that drug has very real toxicities. And again, all the more reason it's important to really do proper studies of it and see whether or not it works.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hoff, there seems to be some discussion and confusion over whether those who have contracted COVID-19 are then immune from contracting the virus again. I've heard it both ways. What can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. At this point, we don't really know. We don't have sufficient information, but most people in the field do believe that the infection itself will induce a protective immune response in most people. Otherwise, you wouldn't clear the virus. Other evidence that suggests that this happens commonly is we have already seen in multiple places in the world that there have been major outbreaks of this infection, but then it seems to slow down, and China has completely reduced to very low levels, and now they're more focused on preventing people from coming into their country with the infection and reintroducing it. So there's that type of, I guess, circumstantial evidence that would suggest that people do develop an immune response that is protective. How good that immune response is, we don't know. Most people in their middle ages, when they have a healthy immune response, will develop a strong immune response to an infection after they develop and while they're clearing it. That usually does provide protective immunity. In fact, I don't know of any good examples to the contrary. But what we don't know is in people that don't have strong immune responses, if they get an infection and they're lucky enough to get over it, then will they be as protected as other individuals? So one point is that it's likely that there's a gradation of the level of protective immunity and that develops after infection. In the bulk of the population that are healthy, the immunity should be good and last at least for several months to a year. And we're hopeful that it might be longer than that, but we don't know at this point. The other issue that's related to this is how do we measure immunity? We don't really know what's protective. We do think, based upon a lot of animal studies, vaccine studies, that antibodies directed against a specific part of the virus that's required to engage a cell that it infects and then initiates the infection. If there are antibodies that can block and bind specifically to that portion of the virus and block the interaction between the virus and the target cell, then you can protect against that cell getting infected. There's T cell responses, which are a different type of immune response that those cells don't make antibodies, molecules floating around that can block things like viruses from infecting cells. They actually recognize infected cells and can destroy them. So that's another part of the immune response that is important in protective immunity and probably is important here too. The tests that are coming out that look at antibody responses and trying to screen people are very new, and we don't know exactly how to use them yet. There could be problems with specificity because we've all been infected with common coronaviruses that circulate every year. And some of these antibody tests may just measure some of the antibodies that preceded the entire COVID-19 problem so far. So there's a lot of unknowns. We do think that most people will have a protective immune response after they clear the infection, but some people may not. And for how long that immunity will persist, we don't know either.
We had a follow-up question, I think that ties into this. It's a little different, but that came from one of the people viewing our Facebook Live tonight. Do we have any idea what percentage of Americans may have contracted COVID-19 and never had any symptoms and never knew they had it? Is there any way to know that?
There is a way to know, and that is to look for immune responses that are specific to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. But we don't have those tests available at this point to use widely to really be able to assess and give a educated answer to that question.
All right, thank you. Dr. George, there have been several questions we received prior to going on the air tonight about whether those who may have had a flu shot or a pneumonia inoculation prior to the outbreak in the United States, if that provides any protection to them. Are they less likely to contract COVID by the fact that they had had those inoculations?
Thank you. Unfortunately, neither of those vaccines, the flu vaccine or the pneumovax vaccine, will provide any protection against COVID-19. COVID-19 virus is totally unrelated to flu virus. It's a very different virus. And the pneumonia vaccine helps protect you against bacteria that cause pneumonia, but not against viruses. So no, there is no cross protection.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hoff, another question that came up several times from some of our viewers and has been talked about a lot, I think, in the media, as to whether COVID-19 could be seasonal. Could we see a drop off in the summer and then mid-fall we could see a spike again? Do we have any anything to tell us about whether that would be the case?
We don't have any specific information for SARS-CoV-2, but it certainly is possible that it could become a seasonal problem going forward. Many other coronaviruses do circulate seasonally and cause the common cold. This is obviously very, very bad, not common, uncommon disease with COVID-19. So I think that we don't know, but it's possible as we move forward with, if it does become seasonal, it's likely that more and more people will develop immunity, just like we just talked about. And so it could mitigate against the severity of disease, morbidity and mortality in future seasons. And certainly we hope to have vaccines and drugs that we know can work that would also help mitigate with the severity of the disease.
Another question, Dr. Hoff, for you. What about the possibility of giving people plasma or antibodies from someone who has been infected with COVID and recovered? Mm-hmm. I'm assuming there are some studies being done of that as well.
Yes, there's very many that there's several that have already been done, and there's a big effort here in the US to try to have volunteers that had gotten COVID-19 and recovered clinically. And if you take serum from those individuals, from their blood, and infuse that into people during an acute infection with SARS-CoV-2, theoretically, they can be protective. This has been it's called passive immunotherapy, which just means instead of actively immunizing or infecting to try to get an immune response, you're transferring these soluble antibody molecules into somebody so they have a preformed immune response. In fact, there's a large multi-center study that our hospital system is planning to be part of, that's being led by the Mayo Clinic after they received emergency use authorization for doing this type of passive immunotherapy. What we don't know about it, though, is what does the level of antibodies that you're transferring in need to be to provide optimal protection. So one thing important to be looking at is, in doing studies like this, always looking at what the antibody titer is that's present, and then learning from the experience of the clinical outcomes what the level needs to be to provide satisfactory protection. Another way of doing this in the modern age is to make what's called monoclonal antibodies. These are antibodies, just a single molecule that's made from one cell, B cell, that is the type of cell that makes antibodies. Lots of companies are making these now. There are cocktails coming out for study. And we've used a lot of monoclonal antibodies in treating people. These are also termed biologics, or things that we use to block inflammatory responses in autoimmune disease, like blocking TNF in patients with autoimmune disease. Antibodies directed against the virus specifically that can block it, like I described before, from infecting a cell, could be very useful and could more easily be reproducible in terms of the optimal dose that could provide the best protection. So these are things that we are planning to study here as we go forward in this pandemic.
Got a question come in, and either Dr. George or Dr. Hoff, either one or both. There's been a lot written about the fact that COVID-19 seems to be more devastating in the African-American community, African-American communities across the country. And do you, in doing the research that you're doing and working with your colleagues, have answers to why that may be the case? Dr. George, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, sadly, COVID-19, like a lot of other diseases, preys on people who have underlying health conditions. And it's not just the African-American community, though they've certainly been very badly affected. But I think the Native American community is also very concerned about this same issue. Diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease, all of those make you at higher risk for having COVID-19 or sadly dying from it if you do get it. And all of those, unfortunately, because of disparities of access to health and access to good food and lots of other social reasons, really, are sadly more common among African Americans and also Native Americans.
If I could follow up on what you've seen, that list of underlying illnesses that people have, is there one or two that seem to be generate worse responses, worse outcomes among that list you said, or is it pretty much the same for all of them?
Well, I think that's the data that's coming in gradually. Certainly diabetes, and in particular, anyone with heart and lung disease is at very high, substantially higher risk. And those are the people who really need to be practicing careful social distancing as much as they conceivably can.
Plus immunosuppressed people, I would just add that. That's another major area. If they don't have a normal immune system, you can't handle any infection very well. But I would just expand a little bit and just say that when people don't have means and don't have health insurance, they tend also not to come for help until it's a later period of time in their disease process. And the longer you wait, the more severe the disease can get. The supportive care may not work at those late stages. So that's another thing that's important. What this pandemic is doing is just amplifying the disparities that we've seen before, mostly related to the comorbid conditions like you've already mentioned.
If I could ask, there's been a lot of discussion and some confusion over the availability of testing to see if people have COVID-19 in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Can you give us some kind of idea of whether tests are available, how long someone would have to wait, and if more tests are on the way for our area? Yeah, Dr. Hoff.
Yes, so this is a big problem in terms of not being able to test everyone we would like to test, which prevents us from knowing who is infected. We've already talked about, we don't know how many, but there are certainly people that never develop any symptoms and do appear to shed virus, because you can at least find that in their nose when you do these PCR tests. How infectious that is, we don't know, but certainly it seems like it is a significant contributor to the problem that we're having now. Since we've had limited ability to test, we haven't been able to see the whole problem. It's like the blind man and the elephant, just touching one part of it And so not really being able to see the entire picture of the spread of this infectious disease. So that is one of the critical things that needs to be developed, so that we can do more widespread testing to really mitigate against a resurgence once any lifting or loosening of social distancing is recommended. Because if we can't track it, it'll get out of hand again. We'll be flying blind. And so we need to be able to test very liberally to make it out of this. There's good news in that there is increasing numbers of tests being done throughout the United States, including in the St. Louis region. There's multiple private companies doing these tests. Currently, though, they take a long time to get back, which interferes with knowing when people can go back to work and so on. Yeah, so it is a big problem, but it's improving. We still need simple things like swabs to collect the samples, like the viral transport media, which is what you put the swab in to get it to the lab and preserve the specimen. So we're seeing signs of improvement, but it's still not sufficient to really see the whole picture of this pandemic.
Great. I want to ask both of you, this is a question for both of you. In your opinion, there have been news stories out this afternoon and this evening related to Missouri, St. Louis City, St. Louis County, about whether we continue with, basically keeping closed or reopening. The governor talked about May 3rd as a possible beginning of a reopening in some parts of the state. The mayor and the county executive both came out today and said they're going to keep the orders, the stay-at-home orders, indefinitely. So I'm not going to ask you to comment on what they said, but in your opinions, what needs to happen or what needs to be available for people in Missouri, Illinois, anywhere to be able to go back and begin to go back to work and doing the things with others and outside that they had done prior to the stay-at-home orders? Dr. Hoff, I'll start with you, but I also want to hear from Dr. George.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very worried about the possibility of prematurely loosening social distancing, and the only measures really that we have right now to tackle this pandemic. Before we can really think about that, I mean, it's possible that within the next month, and that would make sense, but I'd like to see several things first. I'd like to see that our local communities and where we have the worst problems are actually getting a handle on this, and the curve goes down. And we need to see that for not just one time, but a real significant trend that continues for a prolonged period of time before we can even think about that. And we're still going on the upswing, and a couple of things leveling off. But if we loosen now, wouldn't be certain that we would have a resurgence of the infections. The other things that we need, as I've already mentioned, is we need to be able to identify who has infections and where it's spreading to. And with the limited amount of testing that we have right now, we can't really do that yet. So we need to have expanded testing to the point where we could test anyone that we wanted to, symptoms or not, to be able to look at where the virus is spreading to know how to stop it. So that's really a critical thing. In addition, we would like to have not just the PCR testing available, but the ability to test for at least a surrogate of immunity, which may be an overcall, or at least evidence of exposure to the SARS-CoV-2 virus in the past. So meaning like those antibody tests. The PCR test can only detect infection when you have sufficient virus replicating in the nose and in the respiratory passages. It takes several days after exposure and infection for that to occur in most people, or you'd have levels that could be detected. And then it's a transient period of time where you'll be able to detect the virus in the nose. But theoretically, the antibody responses will persist, as we already mentioned, for prolonged periods of time. And that can at least give us a handle on who already have gotten infected, which can tell us, one, where the infection is gone, tell us a lot about the epidemiology, help all of our public health people figure out how to try to stop this. And also it can tell us too, not specifically that somebody is immune or not, but that they are likely to have some immune responses that could be at least somewhat resistant against getting the virus in the future.
Good. Dr. George.
Thank you. I would emphasize again, we really need a lot more testing. I'm working on the hospital right now, and we are admitting patients from nursing homes and care facilities where there are not known to be outbreaks, and those patients are coming in with COVID disease. They didn't get it here in the hospital, they're coming in with it. So that means that there are outbreaks in those nursing homes, those care facilities. We don't even know about them. And we have people coming in from the community, same story. Areas where we don't know there are outbreaks, maybe they report, oh, some of my coworkers were ill, some of the people I hang out with have been ill, and now they have it, and that tells me that there's a lot more out of it than we know. And the epidemiologists are saying for every case we see, there's 5, 10, maybe more than that we aren't seeing. So we're not going to stop this until we really have a lot more testing, as Dr. Hoft was saying.
So as we conclude our Facebook Live tonight, maybe we'll finish on a higher a positive note. I'd like to ask both of you, what gives you optimism for the future in dealing with this, with COVID-19? Dr. George, I'll start with you this time.
Well, we've beaten some very tough viruses and pathogens before. We now have a licensed vaccine for Ebola. We did not have that with the African Ebola outbreak, which I guess was the last big world public health scare. We do have a lot of testing coming online now. We do, as Dr. Hoff said, have antibody testing now just starting to be developed and become available. We've beaten this before, these things before, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take good data and good studies.
Dr. Hoff, what makes you optimistic?
Well, I would say the same things as Sarah, but I would also say that it's just so wonderful to see how many people care about everyone else and are doing everything they can when we don't have a vaccine, we don't have a drug yet. Following social distancing is incredibly important, and everyone is a hero that's doing that. And that fills me with optimism that our American public, the world citizenry, are coming together and trying to help each other and make a big impact on this. We will develop vaccines and drugs that are effective. Can't say exactly when we will have them, but in the meantime, if we work together, we can all fight and beat this thing.
That's a great way to conclude. Thank you. Dr. Sarah George and Dr. Dan Hoff, we all appreciate and thank you for the work that you and your teams are doing to try to find answers to this virus. And you've answered a lot of questions that people had tonight. We thank you both for taking the time to be with us. And we thank all of you who joined us on Facebook tonight. We hope you learned more tonight than you knew when this began. These are two of the renowned experts in the country in dealing with these types of diseases. So thank you again for being with us, and have a good evening. Thank you.